Welcome home to St. Anne's.
You may be seated.
We want you to know that you're welcome to join us at 10 a.m. on Sundays. Please be sure to hit subscribe to receive our sermons. We can't wait to meet you.
Every job description I've seen has included the catch-all, other tasks as assigned. I see lots of nods around the room. Well, that's how life goes. We find ourselves doing things that were not in the job description. The job description at home, in our personal lives, or in the job description at work. Other tasks as assigned. Well, it's part of a well-rounded life, you might say. I've added this open-ended and certain to come about provision to every job description I've had a hand in shaping. In the late 1990s, not long after I was called to serve a church in Seattle, I got a very difficult call. It was the kind of call you never want to get. I was asked to preside at a funeral for a 2-year-old girl who had died in a house fire. I had heard that disturbing news that very morning on the radio, and then sitting in my study at the church, having the phone ring and having someone there saying, "This has happened, would you come and help us?" was something I never thought would happen that day. It wasn't part of my plan. I didn't know this family. They were loosely connected to the church. The grandfather by marriage of the girl who had died had been raised up in my parish, and so that was the only church connection they had, was through the grandfather by marriage. And so they called me, and so I went and sat with them. And I really have to say, I didn't know what to say when I walked in the room. The girl's mother was not even there at the time. She just was unable to be there. So her mother and her stepfather helped prepare the service. Besides, how do you comfort a family who has lost a child? What do you say? Fortunately, I was able to use a new book that had been published by the church for funerals for children. It was much kinder and gentler than the old rites, and that was a good starting point. I just remember the morning of the funeral, walking into that funeral home, which was packed with friends of the family, all the family members, the firefighters and first responders. And I came there with the only comfort that the sure and certain hope that one has in this life is to show up. That's 90% of life. You just need to show up and be there. And I could remember the words of a mentor saying to me at that point, I could remember them when I was walking into that situation, that, it's not about you at all. It's about what you represent. It's about who you represent. You represent Christ. And so I walked in there with a clerical collar on, representing Christ and not myself, and let the words that have been carefully selected to gather up our sorrow and grief and to give voice to the prayers of our hearts. I let them wash over the crowd. And then I spoke some words, hoping that whatever I said was going to be something that would heal. Even though at a moment like that, there's no comfort. The crowd wasn't a church-going crowd anyway. This was in the Northwest, where most people do not claim a church affiliation. It's called the none zone, because when they ask about what's your religious affiliation, they check the box none. So I was in the none zone, but I was in the right zone of being present there in the capacity I could represent, and that was to represent Christ and Christ's love to people in grief. Just like that, we hear in today's gospel reading, Jesus is walking along. He calls a man named Matthew, a tax collector, to follow him. And that evening, Jesus is having dinner in the company of tax collectors and sinners. This is not a group of savory characters. Tax collectors were collaborators with Rome. They collected the tax money on behalf of Rome. And the way they made their living was not because Rome gave them a paycheck. It was because they charged a little extra on the taxes and kept that money to themselves. And so they were making money on the occupation, you can say. They overcharged. They were really despised. No one really likes the tax collector, and these were even worse than the ones we don't like. And so he's there in the house with tax collectors, and I'm assuming this man called Matthew is along with them, and he's there with sinners. Who knows what those people were up to? Were they thieves? Were they extorters? Were they adulterers? Were they unfaithful in their relationships and in their livelihoods? We don't know. We just know that they were sinners, and there was Jesus right in the midst of them. And the one thing that we really don't understand in this whole passage we heard today is that what Jesus does in all of these situations is that he's walking into scandal. First, he's keeping the kind of company your parents told you never to keep. And you know, if you want to bring it down to home today, think of drug dealers, car thieves, convicted sex offenders. You can name it. I mean, these are the people you don't want to hang out with. He's literally rubbing shoulders with creeps. He's having a beer at the local gin mill with the kind of people you shouldn't hang out with. But also, after this dinner, he's walking through, we hear, and he comes into contact with the ritually unclean. A woman comes up behind him. She's been bleeding for years, and she touches his cloak. Already that means he's got what amounted as biblical cooties. It meant that he was now unclean, that he had to rebuild his relationship with God because he had touched what was unclean. And by her faith, she is made well. Jesus tells her that. Your faith has made you well. And then also we hear of the fellow, the leader of the synagogue, who comes and says, "My little daughter is dead, but I know if you come, you will bring her life." And you know, I tell you, that's a real hard one. I think if any of you have ever lost a child, you know, I feel the grief. But so as he's walking along and he's healed this woman who has had the unstoppable menstrual flow, he gets to the house, and of course The house is all in a commotion because there are professional mourners there playing their instruments and singing the songs you sing when somebody dies. And so he comes up to this crowd and he says to them, just wait a minute. She's not dead. She's sleeping. And of course, they laugh their heads off. Who is this kook anyway? Faith is the common thread in this gospel. Matthew had faith and followed. The leader of the synagogue had faith Jesus would raise his daughter, and yes, he would go into that death room and take her hand, and she would be raised up. And the woman had faith that Jesus would heal her of her affliction. Jesus, I would say, is healing the lives of people in order that they may become the people they were created to be. To his detractors, back in the house with the Pharisees, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." That would include all of us. Being church, following Jesus, it is about showing up. Yeah, that's 90% of it. It is about being present to one another and to the world around us. And it is offering what you and I can offer, what we have to offer. And believe me, we underestimate ourselves all the time. We have a lot to offer as we walk along. At a decisive, pivotal moment in the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew's telling of the story of Jesus, there is a scene where the nations are gathered for judgment before the Son of Man. And in that scene, the Son of Man says to some of them, "Come, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." I was really, really glad, overjoyed, you might say. Really, I was really happy when I learned that St. Anne's opened the house over there to house an Afghan refugee family. What a wonderful thing you're doing to help those people who were fleeing the chaos that ensued after the longest war in our nation's history. What you have done there in opening this space, and I don't know how much interaction you have. I imagine there's one or two people who must have more than others do, because faucets do get leaky, and doors do have to be fixed, all those kinds of things. But I have to say to you that I want to thank you that your hospitality is changing the trajectory of one's family's life. You need to believe that. What you're doing in opening your space to that family is changing those lives, and you don't know what that's going to mean down the pike at all. but it is something you chose to do as you walk your way as the people of St. Anne's. Changing the life of people in need happens all the time. It was certainly what I saw when my parish in Seattle hosted an extended family of Kosovars who escaped genocide in their home country in 1999. We met a family of 7 people at the airport. They had one little bag in their possession, no other luggage. They had literally gotten out of their village before it had been attacked and people were killed there. And so they came to us. And it was a very good relationship. The congregation was very involved in getting people to doctor's appointments and making sure the kids were enrolled for school and getting the men in the family to a trade school where they could get into the workforce immediately and use the skills they had with them in this country. They happened to be good masons, so they got work pretty quickly. But in 2011, not long before I finished my ministry at that church, an amazing thing happened. It was Sunday morning, and as I looked out over the congregation, over in that corner, there was a place where, you know how people kind of sit where they always sit? Well, there was a whole group of people over there. Some of them had not been there for a long, long time because they had moved away. And there were other people who just happened to be there that Sunday. See, back out in Seattle, I discovered that my people were on different schedules. A few people came every Sunday. And then most people came either 1 in 3 Sundays or 1 in 5 Sundays, and they considered themselves hyperactive in church. But anyway, so here were all these people sitting in this part of the church, and I saw right in the middle of them that one of those Kosovar refugees named Sabadin was sitting there with a woman. And I don't think the other ones really knew that he was right in front of them at that point. And so, but there they were with the people who had had a hand in helping Sabadin and all of his family, the Ramadanis. And it was just one of those God moments right then and there. At communion that morning, as I started around, or as I was going around the communion rail for about the 3rd time, we had this long communion rail that was like a big square, came around, and so you'd start at one end and go around. When I got to the first corner, and there's no cushion there on the corner, only the stone steps, there was Sabadin kneeling, and he had his hands stretched out. I have to tell you, I just about lost it when I saw that. He had his hands stretched out. Sabadin, a good Muslim, taking the body of Christ. I had stood with their family as they celebrated Eid at the end of Ramadan and had seen how they pray and how they have their life together in Allah. And so he was there, and he took the bread and said, "Thank you." In that very moment, Christ was kneeling at that altar rail. Reaching out in faith to touch others, to raise them up, to bring hope when there is nothing to hope for. This is the heart of the good news of Jesus. It's what you and I are called to do as baptized people, as we go walking through, you and I are to be attentive to what is around us, and when we are able to offer a hand. Strangely, counterintuitively, righteousness, what is good and right, is ours by faith. It comes not by the things we accomplish. That our faith brings us to do those things that we would never imagine ourselves doing. And that becomes, and we are reckoned good with God as righteous by our faith, by our believing, not by our doing, but our believing, our faith is what causes us to act. It's what causes us to reach out a hand to provide a house for a family in need. Faith opens our eyes and hearts to see Christ as we walk along. It moves us to reach out to those who are unlike us. When we welcome and care for those who come to us, whether they walk in the front door of this church or if we encounter them wherever we happen to be, in their sickness, in their pain, in their sorrow, in their grief, in their uprootedness, seen and unseen, when we reach out to them in faith, Christ, my brothers and sisters, is in those other tasks as unassigned. So I ask this day that you pray for the family who live here at St. Anne's, and pray that the kind things you have done for them will make a big difference in all their lives. That living here with you are scientists and maybe a doctor who will discover a cure for a cancer that has afflicted you or someone you love. That they are people whose lives can and will make a difference, because through our following of Christ as we walk along, that's precisely what we're called to do. I invite you to rise as you are able.
We want you to know that you're welcome to join us at 10 a.m. on Sundays. Please be sure to hit subscribe to receive our sermons. We can't wait to meet you.
In one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen. We believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father,